as he has Mountain Rainier. We're good. But tonight's presentation is a little long, and I apologize for that. It's a little techy. I don't apologize for that. It is well chaptered out. I'll show you those in just a sec. And we try really hard to make sure there is room for Q&A. That's actually one of the reasons why it tends to run a little long, is because we try to manufacture questions. We try to encourage them. We're here to engage. I don't want to just sit here and just monotone lecture you all evening, which is kind of what it's probably going to seem like. I love this lecture. We're going to peel back a lot of the industry speak. We're going to go past the PR and the marketing, and we're going to show you a few things that even our corporate manufacturing peeps are not always thrilled we share with you. But this way, when you're looking for a lens, I don't care if it's a Tamron lens or a Sigma lens or anything like that. Lenses all operate by the same rules, and so do cameras. And this way, the idea is that when you're done here, doesn't matter what lens brand you're looking at, you'll be more informed and better able to make a good decision based on the gear you have and where you want to be in the future, and how you want to create, how you want to tell your story. What lenses will be best available to you for that. So obviously by Tamron, but obviously by what best works for your situation and whatever that may be. So I'm also going to mute my video because it doesn't work so well when I show the full screen. This is a PowerPoint presentation. I realize it's still sort of an archaic thing to use, but it seems to still be the best way to share this sort of information. So I'm going to mute my vid, and then we're going to go to PowerPoint here just real quick. All right. So Ben, real quick, if you can unmute and just let me know that I'm easily heard, that would be great.
Easily heard, and I am seeing your screen.
Excellent, beautiful, good deal.
I'm seeing your screen loud and clear with my ear eyes.
Awesome, excellent, your earballs, as it were. So these are the chapters we're going to be running with today. The first chapter that we go over is very quick and clean. It's a chapter that lens manufacturers have a certain bone to pick as far as the industry is concerned, and that is the rule concerning focal length and how it's measured and why no crop sensor affects it, and neither is there any benefit in magnification to crop sensors whatsoever. It's an urban myth. And we'll talk about all the rest of this as we go. This presentation was built around the idea of an actual live classroom, obviously. You guys are welcome to take screenshots. We don't have any problems with that. It's not a proprietary presentation necessarily. We don't generally record it, and it's because we do talk bluntly about ourselves as manufacturers, but we also do talk about other manufacturers specifically, and not in any way to disparage them, but to showcase what technology is and how everything interacts. And we do need to be specific in some cases on how that works. So it's not just about Tamron 24/7. We just happen to sponsor the lecture and we did write it. There's nothing fraudulent in here. These things are all the real deal. But to save sensibilities, and in some cases because we partner with them in a lot of ways in the background, we don't record it out of respect. In case, so that's why I do suggest if you are doing screen grabs, this is not a bad idea. But moving forward, let's do, where are you at, little one? There we go. So one thing about focal length to understand is that it is a linear measurement. If it says 15 millimeters on your lens, the optical center of your lens is 15 millimeters away from your sensor when your lens is focused to infinity. So understand that there's no guarantee for your angle of coverage. There's no guarantee for brightness at any given focal length either. It's just a linear measurement of where the optical center of your lens is when you're focused to infinity in comparison to your sensor. So when we talk about angles of coverage, we'll talk about focal length and sensor size, because the smaller the sensor, the smaller the angle of coverage. It's just you're projecting light into a smaller area, and that's what you get. So when you look through the window of a smaller sensored camera, you end up with what looks like a magnified image in comparison to a larger sensored product, when it's really a crop. And that's why they use the term crop sensor. I can crop a full frame image 1.5x and have the same exact image as a crop censored APS-C product. There is no magnification benefit. So a lot of people like to buy the smaller censored cameras because the subject takes up more of the frame, but it's not a magnification property. If you need magnification, you buy a bigger lens. There's no 300 millimeter lens that can simulate what a 600 millimeter lens can do. 600 millimeter lenses have a hyperfocal distance of a certain distance. They have a certain type of compression. They have a certain way of separating fields that no 300 millimeter lens can do. And so we as a lens manufacturer, we especially get really weirded out when a sales associate you might be talking to about a micro four thirds product brings out a 70 to 300 millimeter lens and places it on the counter, but then brings out either a Sigma 150 to 600 or a R 150 to 600, and then proceeds to tell you that they're the same thing. They are clearly not. Not just because they're clearly smaller versus bigger, but because one of them is actually a 150 millimeter to 600 millimeter lens with all of the magnification, hyperfocal distance, and hyperfocal compression properties of a 150 to 600. The other is a 70 to 300 millimeter lens that's being projected on a smaller sensor. That's it. That's the way it is. If you want 600 millimeters, you got to buy a 600 millimeter lens. So we want to make that absolutely clear. Equivalency is a big bug in our bonnet, as it were. Also, to keep in mind, true, that focal length is still a measurement only when the lens is focused to infinity. There's that concept of focal breathing that a lot of reviewers really get obsessed about, and happens to a lot of zoom lenses and no small amount of prime lenses, where as we get closer to our subject, the lens may change the distance of the optical center and to enable you to focus at really close distances. Back in the day where we might have had less breathing in, say, a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, we would be focusing at 200 millimeters both at infinity, but also at a minimum object distance of, say, 7 feet in front of us. But now, if we allow a little breathing, a little movement of that optical center, we can allow a 70 to 200 millimeter lens to focus down to 30 inches, which is fantastic. Is it as tight as an quote unquote actual 200 millimeter at that point? No, but now you can work in a much smaller area with a 70 to 200, and it enables a greater versatility on the lens. To each their own. A lens that doesn't have that breathing problem is called parfocal. And parfocal lenses are very important in video production, the way that they need to keep the same size and shape of field as the camera moves further or closer to the subject. And that is a very big deal in cinema and in a lot of film production. But as far as still photography goes, it's much smaller of an issue, and it shouldn't be as big of a deal unless it's something you truly have to obsess about. But this is one of the best designs that I've seen or showcases that I've seen of what's being focused and where that optical center is. If you have a 600 millimeter lens, the optical center of the lens when it's focused at infinity is 600 millimeters away from the sensor. If you have a 15 millimeter fisheye, the optical center of the lens is 15 millimeters away from the sensor. So yes, that does mean in some cases, for some lenses, the optical center is outside and behind the lens. But that's the point at which all the lines converge and then create a sharp projected image. We've all seen something like this previously. I do want to give credit to our friends at the schoolofphotography.com. They have a lot of really great stuff to learn from over there. And this was one of the best format graphics that I've ever seen. It makes things a lot simpler, where you can see what a, whoa, that's weird. I need to get that, rid of that, thank you. Where you can actually see the difference in sensor sizes from the full frame 35 millimeter format to an APS-C sensor like what would be used in a Nikon D500 or a Canon 7D or a Rebel. And then micro four thirds, of course, our friends at Olympus and a great many of the Panasonic products use a sensor in this category, where we have what we consider to be the full frame, the full size format for the industry. Crop sensor APS-C is usually 1.5x, 1.6x smaller. And then, of course, the micro four thirds sensor is a crop factor of 2x. It's 1/4 the size of a full frame sensor. So to understand, when I'm working with, say, a 400 millimeter lens or whatever focal length was used to take this image, If I'm working with a full frame sensor like a Canon 5D or an Nikon D, a Sony A7, then I am getting at 600 millimeter this entire image. I am viewing this whole thing one-to-one inside my viewfinder. But when I use a crop camera, the amount of image I'm actually getting is either within the APS-C area or within the micro four thirds area. The size of the image doesn't change, but the size of the capture device does. So in the case of the micro four thirds, it's capturing 1/4 the size versus 2/3 the size versus one-to-one. So I hope this helps you guys understand where crop sensors come into play and how they can look magnified. I mean, this looks like the owl takes up so much more space when in fact it obviously does not when you compare it to the rest of the image frame. I can take a full frame sensor, crop it 2x, and get that same field of coverage. The one benefit that the crop sensor products typically bring, not always, but typically bring, is that they do bring greater pixel pitch, greater pixel density. So you can have more pixels per square inch on the smaller sensor, and that will occasionally look a little higher resolution as long as the lens is capable of resolving that. You may see at times some reviewers will review a lens on a 24 megapixel full frame, and then they'll review that same lens on a 24 megapixel crop sensor. And they'll say, well, you see, this lens doesn't work as well on the crop sensor camera. They're not doing that correctly. That crop sensor product at 24 megapixels has the same pixel density as a 36 megapixel full frame camera. So if they wanted to play it equally, they would put the lens on a 36 megapixel full frame, test it, and then put it on the 24 megapixel crop sensor and test it, and they would find that they would actually look very similar at that point. A number of reviewers, unfortunately, don't understand that component of camera architecture, and they do mislead a lot of people into thinking full frame lenses can't perform on crop sensor products. It's completely false. A lot of full frame lenses perform exceedingly well on crop sensor products. It's just the needs are the same. I need resolution. I need lines per millimeter. I need to be able to resolve that pixel density on that smaller pitch. That's all. So if I were to summarize this presentation, it's the world's largest lens manufacturer, which Tamron is by a factor of 30, by the way. It's the world's largest lens manufacturer, really complaining about how hard it is to make you people happy with anything ever. Seriously, it's just a pain. We have problems because the manufacturers of cameras feel the same way, and they want to give you as many pixels as they possibly can, and menus of 450 pages plus branched menus at that point, because they don't want you to feel like you're missing out on any features. And it comes to a point where we're throwing everything at you, both the lens manufacturers and the camera manufacturers, and we still have to figure out how to do it to a point where you're actually interested in buying the product for a specific amount of cash flow. So when we're looking at our side of the equation, the lens side of the equation, this is true for me, for Sigma, for Tokina, for even the lens manufacturing side of Canon, Nikon, Sigma, Sony, and otherwise. We generally have 4 things that we're trying to get a lens to do. In the 5th, we would like it to be well built, and then we have that little asterisk at the bottom. We need to make sure that we can afford it, and we need to make sure that you're willing to pay for it as well. Because in the end, money is the problem solver. It's the one that dictates what corners get to be cut. All lenses need to be bright, and in fact, if you have a really high resolution product, and by high resolution I mean anything above 24 megapixels today, you may not know, but the highest resolution 35 millimeter format film ever produced, only 2 of them ever reached 24 megapixels. One was Astia 100 by our friends at Fujichrome, and the other was Kodak's TechPan 25, a really esoteric black and white pan film that if you processed correctly in microdoll at certain temperatures could reach 24 megapixels. Those were the only 2 films that ever did it. Most film reached somewhere between 12 and 18 megapixels, and some films were quite a bit worse. If any of you shot film for a long time, you remember Goldmax 800 might have been like VGA. That stuff was terrible. So our lenses really didn't need to be all that great back in the day. As long as light hit film, film was happy. Unfortunately, not the case for sensors. We do need to make lenses that are specifically built for sensor application, and not just because of the way pixels are shaped, but also because of how many there are. The more pixels you have, the more eyeballs you have on the flaws in front of you, and the good stuff, but the more eyeballs you have on flaws. If you go from a 24 megapixel D750 Nikon to the 47 megapixel D850, you're going to see what your lens is not capable of. There are not many lenses in the market that can truly handle 50 megapixels. It's around 15% of the market. And so it's one of those things where you may find out very quickly that not only did you upgrade your camera, but your lenses will soon have to follow. And I hate to be the harbinger for that. If you had netting before, it will be worse now. If you had chromatic aberration before, it's going to be worse on the higher resolution sensor. High-res sensors are asking for things that lenses never had to do in the days of analog. And that's why they keep getting bigger. Too, even though we keep trying to find ways to shrink them, they do keep getting bigger because more pixels require more light. Hence, number one, all lenses need to be bright. As much light from front to back as humanly possible, we try to be as high a transmission. Every time light hits one piece of glass, it shaves a little bit off itself. And then if you have 30 elements inside a lens, it's shaving light off of itself 30 times. And I still need to figure out how to make it bright by the time it finishes at the back end of that lens. The other thing that it has to do is it has to stay neutral. We need to keep all the colors combined equally so that white stays white. Now I know you guys have your white balance mechanisms on your cameras, and you can go shoot raw and do white balance in post-production, but that doesn't mean you want a lens that constantly shifts to the green or to the blue or to the pink. You want things to be as neutral as possible, so your job as post-production artists is a lot easier, frankly. At Tamron, we actually aim for dynamic range. We have lenses that tend to look a little lower contrast, but we don't clip in the highlights, and we don't crush the shadows as much as a lot of other lens manufacturers do. Our job is, we believe you want to shoot in RAW. We believe you want to do post-production. So our job is to give you as many color gradients as possible. And so we do that by giving you dynamic range, and we try to keep that dynamic range as neutral as possible. After we've got your color corrected, we need to keep all your lines straight, because for some reason, fisheye just doesn't interest anybody or a whole lot of people these days. So we want to keep all the lines straight from top to bottom, left to right. I don't want pin cushion where it's bowing outwards or it's bowing inwards. I don't want the barrel distortion where it's bowing outwards. I'm trying as hard as I can to keep buildings looking straight, to keep trees tall, and to make sure people don't look like aliens when the day is done, unless I want to do it on purpose. And then lastly, yeah, we have to be able to match the resolution of the camera that we're on. If the lens can't match the resolution of the camera, you're going to be disappointed. It's going to be soft. You will not be able to just unsharp mask your way out of it or high pass filter your way out of it in post-production. You're going to want a lens that can actually handle the acuity of your sensor. And you'll find out real quick if you can. Anybody who, again, went from the D750 to the D850, I use it just because it's just a huge jump in resolution. And a lot of people made the leap from 24 megapixels to 47. One of the other things that they saw was that their handheld technique was terrible, because all those extra pixels suddenly saw that they couldn't hold a camera steady to save their life. So not only do we need that defined capability of resolution, but maybe we need stabilization at the same time, something to be discussed later in the presentation. And then lastly, yes, you're investing a lot of money in this piece of glass, and you should, I think, be guaranteed a certain longevity out of it. So it would be nice if it was at least moisture resistant, if not completely weather sealed and dust proofed. And as you move up through cost vectors and lens lineups, obviously more lenses than others will not necessarily be completely proofed, but maybe at least have a gasket around the back end. But it's important because dust, of course, is a major problem in DSLRs and especially mirrorless cameras that can't keep dust out of themselves to save their lives. If you have a lens that's gasketed and sealed, you will at least be less likely to get dirt inside your camera. So you should ask if your lens is weather sealed. That should be a big question. And you will be amazed at how many lenses, including really expensive ones, are not. And so that's one of the few areas where I will toot Tamron's horn, is we're the only company that weather seals every lens we produce right now. And note, an all metal construct is not always good. Metal does not bounce. Metal does not reform when it takes a hit. Metal doesn't like shock, which is why a lot of the really big, bad $12,000 lenses are metal on the outside and polycarbonates on the inside because they can handle shock better when you do that. So don't scoff at plastic or polycarbonate based lenses. Sometimes they can handle certain forms of abuse better than the metal ones can. A good weather sealed lens will have gaskets throughout, front and back, all throughout the lens, and of course at least one on the back to keep the dust off of the sensor bay in and of itself. But I'd like to have everything throughout as much as possible. And then if you can, look for lenses and filters, by the way, with repellent coatings. We use fluorine ourselves when we're using repellent coating. It is an actual coating put on the lens. This is a photograph. One of those big, huge marks a lot markers was used for this image. And this is the coated side, obviously, and this is the uncoated side. And if it's uncoated, that marks a lot marker is probably not going anywhere. But on the coated side, I've been known to play tic-tac-toe on our big 150 to 600 element quite a lot. And it's just as a point of proof, and it's got good shock value too. I'm not saying you should do it, but it's a lot of fun for me to do it. Tamron won't be quite as mad at me as if they might be at someone else. So on the basis of all of what we just talked about, we start talking about somewhat the design here. And we can't talk about lens design without giving our friends at Leica some credit, because Leica, of course, popularized the 35 millimeter format. So many renditions of today's optics, the foundations of where we began with 35 millimeter and therefore APS-C and other formats begin and end with Leica optical design in Germany back in the 1920s and to the 1950s. I love this design here because it's just so simple. Straight up 50 millimeter f3.5 that was good enough to last for almost 40 years in production. And that's just not something we get anymore. You know, today, you know, Tamron has a 6-year warranty on all of our lenses. And I'm hoping that some of those lenses aren't outclassed in 6 years by modern sensor design, because they keep pushing resolutions to these outer boundaries. Now that we're up to 60 megapixels and we know 80 is coming, we have to keep designing our lenses in a forward production model. So this nice 50 millimeter lens here really obviously didn't have a whole lot of work it had to do. Its job of keeping light, bright, white, and straight and defined is really not a big deal. It only required 4 pieces of glass. They were hand cut. They were hand polished by an optics master out of Germany, which is a level of romance that I still wish I could attain. But all it required was 4 pieces of glass. The lens was about 1 inch long. It didn't look like anything special, but it performed well enough for 40 years. Today's lenses for 60 plus megapixels, now this is a 45 millimeter, and it looks like this, where suddenly we went from 4 pieces of glass to about 13. And we have introduced stabilization, because stabilization helps high resolution sensors perform better, because we're keeping the image itself stabilized. We've also introduced a macro function. This particular lens focuses down to 11 inches, where that Leica lens focused down to about 18 inches. So this lens is a little bit more versatile. It's higher resolution. It's brighter because it's a 1.8, so it's almost 2 stops brighter than that 3.5. But one of the things to note is if you look really carefully, you see this design, these 4 elements here, you will still see that lens inside of ours. And I love this. This is as close to a scientific homage to your predecessors as we can come. Our 45 millimeter, 43 millimeter, by the way, is human vision. It's not 50. 50s are just really easy to build after all these years. 45 being closest we have come to human vision in some time, but we're still using that optical protocol that Leica began. And this is sort of our homage to glamour lenses of the 1930s, 1940s. If you guys are into your studio photography and you've been kind of looking for a classic Life magazine, Look magazine back in the day type of profile, this is your lens. And it was built specifically around an idea that began in 1925. And it's a personal favorite, and I know Ben loves it as well. So, oh, go ahead, Ben. I hear you. So when we're looking at lenses, the biggest corner cut in manufacturing, where we have to come to a point where we need to save some money, both for us and for you, but yeah, definitely for us. The biggest corner cut you're going to find is in the chromatic aberration category. And we're still looking to fix it. We're still looking to correct as much of it as possible because nobody likes having rainbows all over their shots, not unless they are working with Topaz or Luminar doing sky swaps. They don't want it out of their lens as much as humanly possible. So we are still working with low dispersion and extra low dispersion elements. If you read up on your lenses and they talk about how they're really proud to have LD or XLD or ULD or HLD or OLD, there's a lot of acronyms in our industry that all mean pretty much the same thing. An LD element is an element that is trying very hard to keep the light white. One of the things light really likes to do is split into the rainbow prism instantaneously. Anytime it hits a piece of glass, it's ready to go color grade. It wants to show you its rainbow flag as much as possible. And so this is a big corrective factor in every lens. Every lens would have rainbows everywhere if we didn't do this. Especially big lenses, your telephoto lenses with big front ends. And the lenses that are really affected by this are ultra wides and really bright primes. The primes that everybody just lusts over, the really big diffuse babies, they have tons of candy. They have a lot of chromatic aberration problems. And we do, as all manufacturers do, we often rely on lens profiles given to Adobe or Capture One or collaborated with, or occasionally Adobe might do whatever they feel is necessary to fix it, whatever they want to do. But a lot of times we will correct to a certain point, a certain financially reasonable point, and then we'll hope that you know what you're doing in post-production where you'll work the lens profile to finish it off. But you'll know LD glass here has been around for decades. It's been a necessity since the day one of lens design, trying to get rid of chromatic aberrations. And you'll see a lot of LD optics in telephoto lenses in particular, and they're generally going to be in kit lenses also. Anytime you get an anime word like extra, ultra, high, something of that nature, extreme, before the letters LD, you'll know that you are coming into a lens that's very complex, probably had some very serious issues with chroma before they figured out how to correct it. And it does mean A, it's probably very well corrected, and it does mean B, that because of the extended expense in glass, it's going to be more expensive for you as well. You see a lot of XLD, HLD, OLED type glass in ultra wide lenses, and you'll also tend to see them in the wide angle zooms like a 24-70-2.8 or a 24-105 or 24-120. The 24-70-105-120 zoom, those are the weakest performing zooms in the industry, and they are also the ones that have generally the most problem with chroma correction, because going from a curved wide field to an uncurved or a flattened telephoto field is very difficult to correct for. And so it's one of those things where if you want a really good one, it gets real complex, and you will see XLDs under the hood for that. A-spheres. A-spheres are lens elements, pieces of glass that really came to the fore in the early 1980s. Without A-spheres, zoom lenses today would not exist. An aspherical element is an oddly shaped piece of glass. It's not a sphere, it's not round. It'll have round edges, but often flatten out in other edges, or go from a spherical to a non-spherical edge. Whatever it takes to get the light corrected, A-spheres were a revolution. And we now have this one little element, this funky little shaped element that replaces up to what used to be up to 5 pieces of glass in a lens. So think of what that did for your zoom lens. One element where 5 used to be means that I'm 1/5 the weight. I only have to make 1 piece of glass where there used to be 5. So I may not be 1/5 the cost, but I'm definitely much more cost effective. And I'm not losing the amount of light that 5 pieces of glass will shave off. I'm only losing the amount of light that 1 glass element will shave off. So I'm lighter, I'm cheaper, and I'm brighter. This is one of those areas where the innovation really just changed the game for everybody, user to manufacturer. It happens that Tamron is the world leader in aspheric element production. And at one point, I was told that we make up to 95% of all molded glass A-spheres in the industry, in the photo industry. So you may not have Tamron on your lens, but it's almost a guarantee that you have us in your lens. We're very good at that. The bottom one, the expanded glass mold, is the reason why the ultra wide revolution has taken place over the last 10 years. This is a a brand new form of glass mold where we figured out how to shrink and reduce up to 5 elements in what would what now allows us to see 15 millimeters better corrected than ever before, or 14 or even 12 millimeters better corrected than ever before. This one piece of glass that Tamron invented a decade ago allowed the ultra-wide revolution to begin. At a telephone, this is a very standard telephoto design, the 150-600 G2. Uh-oh. The 150-600 G2. It doesn't look all that complex. Telephoto lenses don't have a lot of work to do. They don't see a big wide field. Their job is magnification without distortion. You'll notice that we have one big front corrective plate, and then we have two LD plates behind it in the front here. This is a 95 millimeter front end. This is like a window on an airplane. And so when light strikes that plane, it turns into a rainbow instantaneously. And we have to just make sure these two guys here just keep it going back to white. And then we have one more LD element right here, and that's there because of the image stabilization unit. If you think about it, with an image stabilization unit, I'll have a piece of glass or a couple pieces of glass that are moving up and down or back and forth in some cases, or all over the place, and that will create aberrations in the back. So this guy here is making sure our stabilization doesn't cause a problem in the image quality. And that's something a lot of people don't know, is that occasionally an image stabilizing unit can in fact lower the quality of an image. And we'll talk about that later on, but it is not always the saving grace. Stabilization units have a usable parameter. If you step outside that parameter, it can ruin your day. An outstanding ultra wide zoom. This is the 15 to 30. This is the second generation 15 to 30 for Tamron. This is a great look at what the inside of an ultra wide zoom can do. It's a lot of glass. It's a ton of correction. We start out here at about 165 degrees of coverage, where we're bringing in all the light and all the field from 165. And as we start correcting, you can almost feel the image get flattened as the corrective values change here. And then everything back here is about just making sure it stays bright, white, straight, and defined. But from 165 degrees, really a fisheye, total barrel distortion, it's going to look like a fisheye shot. By the time it hits the back, it's about 112, 113 degrees, but all the lines are straight, everything is flat. It's a masterpiece in curvature correction, as are most ultra-wide zooms today. This is that XGM, that brand new piece of glass that's just a little older than 10 years old nowadays. This is, of course, a modern rendition, but this piece of glass replaces up to 5 pieces of glass, which means this lens would have weighed about a pound more and would have been about $1,000 more, and it would have been unfortunately, a much less efficient construct. It would have been a terrible lens. This lens fixes this element fixes this lens, makes it cheaper, lighter, and brighter. Everything is happy. Just because this exists, we're all better photographers. And then a personal favorite, where this is one of the very few true all-in-one lenses that can actually stay sharp with no chromatic aberration across the board, 35 to 150. And because of these hybrid A spheres that are also coded to be low dispersion elements, hybrid A spheres will have double track duty. They'll be designed to replace multiple elements, and they will have the duties of, say, a low dispersion element as they work. They're very intense pieces of glass. They're very expensive, but fortunately, when they're produced in volume, they're not as costly. So, but the reason why the 35 to 150 does so well without chromatic aberrations is because it's got a lot of correction value for it, and it starts at a flatter field. That everyone wants that 24 wide, but you really sacrifice image quality to do it if you want a lot of zoom on that lens. If you step from 24 to 35, your image quality skyrockets, and it's worth just having like a 17 to 35 to complement this piece instead. So I've been buzzing about chroma the entire freaking time we've been talking here the last like 15 minutes. And this is an example of what it is. Basically, it's your lens's inability to correct all color wavelengths to white at all times. And in reality, there are really 2 forms of chromatic aberration. Longitudinal, what you'll hear the reviewers affectionately refer to as LOCA, longitudinal chromatic aberration. And that's where the rainbow effect at high contrast areas is across the entire sensor. So a lens is not just not well corrected, it means that it's not well corrected across the entire frame. And this is, again, common in telephoto lenses, and it's common in really, really, really bright primes. 85 1.4s, 135 1.8s, 105 f2s, stuff like that. It's very common. It's not because we're not trying. It's not because your manufacturer doesn't want to give you a better image. It's just that there comes a point where size, weight, and cost dictate we have to let some of this go. Same goes for the wide angle lenses. Your 24 to 120s, your and the 15 to 30. The 15 to 30s, your 14 to 24s, 12 to 24s. They'll all have a little bit of lateral chromatic aberration, and that's where you'll see the rainbows in the very extreme corners of the image at high contrast areas. The center is well corrected, but the corners may have some problems with contrast. The loca, the one where it's across the entire image, can be mitigated pretty easily when you're shooting. If you're shooting, say, a 35 1.4 and you notice you have a lot of chromatic aberration across the frame, if you stop it down to around an f2, it's probably mostly gone by that point, if not all gone. A really good lens design will probably have it cleaned up by that point, where you just stop it down and letting the aperture do the rest of the correction value will take care of it. Lateral chromatic aberration is not as well controlled by aperture stoppage and will more rely on a lens profile down the road in Adobe or in someplace like that, wherever you go. So just note that while this one is less noticeable in the frame, it's also the hardest to correct, where this one I can at least stop the lens down while I'm shooting. And if I'm not stopping the lens down because I bought my 35 1.4 to shoot it at 1.4, then I just need to realize that it will be a step in my post-production process to clean up the end. And this frame just says everything I just said. Longitudinal chromatic aberration is chromatic aberration across the board. In all high contrast areas where a dark area immediately turns to bright, I will have a pink and blue hue or some form of cyan and magenta or green and magenta outline around it. I know you guys have seen it in the past. In fact, your cameras will have lens profiles on board to help you correct for it now. If you're shooting JPEG, you may not have to worry about this because the lens profiles are built in, and JPEG is really well corrected in this regard. JPEG will correct for vignetting, distortion, chromatic aberration, and try to give you a nice, clean, easily printable image right now. But if you're shooting RAW, the profile is embedded in your metadata, but it is not applied to the image until you work in your post-production process. So that's another reason why RAW files often look worse, is because they're not fully corrected profiles. This is a really good example of longitudinal chromatic aberration of loca, where you can see big time. We've got heavy cyan green fringing in the back, heavy magenta green imaging in the, fringing in the front. We did pick this up from our friends at Photography Life. This is a great website. If you want more of this technical stuff and you want to really dig in deep, Photography Life is really good to go for. This is a well-lauded, well-renowned 35mm 1.4. It's a $1,700 lens. And this is what it looks like wide open at 1.4. And I'm not here to pick on anybody, so I'm not telling you whose 35 it is. And in fact, if that manufacturer were here, one of the things they would tell you is they'd say, look, okay, yes, we have loca problems. We have longitudinal chromatic aberration, and it's throughout the frame. We won't argue that. But check out our light transmission to the corner. Check out how low our vignetting is. We don't have really any noticeable vignetting from corner to corner. And wide open, our resolution, our edging, and our contrast and acuity is excellent as well. So we were able to correct for 3 legs of the optical dog. And we figured, well, if you wanted all 4 and we wanted to get rid of the loca, we would either have to charge you $1,000 more, probably add another ½ pound to the lens design, and we figured you probably wouldn't pay for it, nor would you want to carry it. And this is a profile that is easily given to our friends at Adobe or Capture One or whatever, where it's really consistent across the board. And since it's a linear correction, it's not something that changes all over the place. It's a very easy profile to mix in. You just hit one button or hit the slider, and it's gone. And we'd rather it would be an easy fix for you in post-production than $1,000 more for either one of us on the back end. So keep in mind, while, yeah, I know this looks pretty bad. If you do want to shoot 35-1.4 on this particular lens, you will be doing some post-production. But understand that a lot of the other features, there are other 35-1.4s that can't match this corner reproduction at all. In fact, there's some 35-1.4s that are pretty clean this way and are really tearing the corners. So I don't know, but to each their own, I guess. But this is just a good example of what you're going to have to consider when looking into lenses, and why I'm a huge, huge proponent of renting before you buy. So do we have any questions on chromatic aberration and correction so far? How are we doing, my Ben?
We're doing great. No questions as of yet. Got a question once we hit the break, a question about something else that we'll ask you, but as far as a CA or any of that, nothing yet. Let's just keep on keeping on.
You got it. You know, if you want to inform Ben that you're really bored, just hold down the Z button like you're sleeping and we'll know. It's good. So another big misconception is that an aperture is an aperture is an aperture, and that is not correct. The first thing that a lot of people think is that a given f-stop ratio immediately means a bright lens or a brighter lens, and that is not always the case. You can have 4 70-200 2.8 lenses for full frame all in a row, put them on the same camera, take the same image at the same exposure value, and you will have different densities to those images. There will be at least 1 or 2 that are very much brighter and have higher transmission than the others. And you'll have one that always ends up being the dark one, the one that always gets slagged for being the muddy looking lens because it doesn't let as much light through. It's a low transmission lens. And this is just one example of that. Again, not trying to pick on anybody. This was a good comparison done by Dustin Abbott, who's an excellent reviewer on YouTube, one of the better ones. If you are willing to commit to really long and in-depth YouTube videos, you will know about the lens you are going to buy or the camera you're going to buy if he reviews it. It's excellent. This is a good example where our lens happened to be a half stop brighter than the competition, and it's the reason why the competition released a version 3 of their lens so they could at least match our transmission value. So now the new lens and our lens are tied as the brightest 70-200s in the industry, where everyone else is not as bright as we are. And that may not seem like a big deal unless you're into sports photography and all that extra light means extra shutter speed, or I can use a lower ISO and keep my grain down. Same for anybody shooting theater or concert photography, where that extra amount of light will allow you to work with a faster shutter speed and freeze difficult lighting and difficult motion at the same time. And also autofocus systems need as much light as you can possibly give them because they are the weak link in camera manufacturing. A brighter lens will have better focus capacity. And so if you have a lens that's higher transmission than another that you're looking at, and autofocus accuracy and speed is your thing, that may very well make your decision up when you're deciding to buy a lens. So consider that. There are bright 2.8s, there are dark 2.8s, there are bright f4s, and there are dark f4s. Not every f ratio is the same. And in fact, even just as a small tangent, working on depth of field, your f ratio is a ratio because it is vastly dictated by the size of your sensor. A smaller sensor will have a smaller hole for the same f number. So a 1.4 on a full frame lens is a larger back end or a larger hole in the lens with less depth of field and more light coming into the camera body than a 1.4 lens designed for APS-C or a 1.4 lens designed for micro four thirds. As the lenses get smaller, the back end shrinks, you will gain depth of field and you will not necessarily have as much light coming through. The fact that they're built for the smaller sensor does help focus the light a little better so you don't lose like a full stop difference, but understand that the bigger lenses made for bigger sensor formats do have advantages when it comes to shallow depth of field at the very least, if not light transmission.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
Let me stop you right there real quick. This would be a perfect opportunity to take a couple questions that we had. The first being in regards to if you have a 24 megapixel camera, one full frame and the other cropped, would the pixels be bigger on the full frame and capture more light?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
So since I have a larger surface area but the same amount of pixels, To cover that surface area, my stencil sites will be larger. They will capture more light information. They will work less hard in low light. They will have more dynamic range as long as that processor behind it is as good. Um, and it will also be lower contrast. So it won't be as poppy in the saturation and black-white ratios, but you'll have really good gradation from white to black, and you'll be able to have a real malleable file in post-production versus the same resolution in a smaller sensor.
Cool. And then another quick question here, just regards to, before we move away from the CA too much. Someone was asking, I didn't see a side-by-side, but maybe you could describe what the difference between, you have the image of the 3514 with all the green and the purple, the difference between that and then a lens that's like you resolved for the 35 or for the CA, and what the difference would be between you with or without.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So basically, that image with rainbows, those rainbows would not be present. None of that color fringing would be there. Black would stay black, white would stay white. There would be defined edges that did not have color values, unnecessary color values attached. So it would look like it would in real life. If I'm looking at that lens align board in real life, I see where the black and the white end, and I see where all the lines are, and everything is good. My lens captures it and sends it to the sensor, and the sensor goes, well, that's a lot of rainbow that the lens is giving me. It'd be the same thing as looking at the image you just saw on screen with all the rainbows versus looking at it in real life where there aren't any. A corrected lens will not have those rainbows. Every color value will stay where it should.
Cool. That's it for now. Let's
All right.
push forward.
So how do we make a lens bright? First is quality of glass formula, of course. If I'm either making or purchasing better Coke glass to mold, cut, polish, and coat, I'm automatically going to have better refractive index, better transmission values, better color neutrality. So the quality of the glass going into the lens does make a difference. But another value that needs to be looked at is what coatings go onto those lenses. This is every time, of course, light hits a piece of glass and travels through it, it shaves a bit of itself off. And it also tries to turn into rainbows. What we don't think, while we don't necessarily think of glass this way, each glass, because of its thickness, has a beginning edge, a well, if you will, a room between the beginning edge and the rear edge. So front edge, room, and rear edge. And inside that room, if I'm not properly coated on both the front and rear edges, light can be captured in there like a well and cause flare. And I'll show you an image here in a second that really shows that off. And Ben posted it on his Instagram the other day. It's one of my favorites. Without proper coatings on your lenses and without proper coatings on the front element, on the rear element, and all the elements throughout, you would just end up having a barrel that just captures light and just kind of looks like a flashlight, glaring in and out of everything. We're trying to reduce flare, sure, but we're also trying to reduce reflections between elements as it bounces through the lens. I want light to fall through my lens from the front to the back. I just want it to just drop through it almost as effortlessly as possible, as if there's nothing there. We're just gently guiding it and reshaping it and keeping it bright and keeping it white and defined as we move it down. We're not trying to force it into anything. And so by the time it hits the back end, we have lost very little light as far as percentages go, and we keep it all neutral and sharp and all that good stuff. And coatings play a huge role in this. I do not want light bouncing between my front element and the next element behind it. I don't want light bouncing off of my sensor and hitting the rear element of the lens and creating flare in that fashion. That's known as sensor flare. And back in the day, when lenses were still mostly from the film base, it happened a ton. Film lenses do not always perform well, or at least to spec on digital bodies. I don't want to say don't perform well because sometimes rendering is to someone's particular taste, and I'd never want to talk bad about that. But maybe that flare that they love so much, someone else will hate, but it's caused because the coatings on a film lens are not the same as required as those on a digital. And so we do have to deal with transmission which is broadband anti-reflection coatings. And we do have to deal with internal ghosting and flare, and that's where nano coat or multi-layer coatings come into play on lenses. Everybody's heard the term nano. In fact, a couple of our manufacturers, they advertise it as if it's a better glass. It's not better glass. It's a better coating process. It's a high-end, high transmission, highly corrective value. It's a coating applied at nanomolecular levels. It's a very finely sprayed, tempered, and hardened coating bonded to the glass. And in some forms of glass, especially LD, XLD, in some cases, there will be a chemistry in the glass that allows for some of this correction as well. But nano is not a type of glass. It is a type of coating, and it's nice to have it. I would like to have as little ghosting in my lens as possible. If I have the perfect lens, I won't have any flare or ghosting. It'll just be sharpened right all the way through. And then with the broadband AR coatings, anything anti-reflection, especially on the front and back, we're just trying to help the light fall through as cleanly as possible. This is an excellent example. This little blase slide here. On the right here, we've got what would be a conventional coating, like almost plate glass, like the windows that you might have at home, or even your windshield. Most windshields are terrible optically; they suck. I would like to have multi-layer coating on my windshield if it wasn't going to be 50 grand to do it. But if I just have regular coating, light comes in and most of it leaves. Unfortunately, I lose a lot of light in reflection. And this is actually a good place to chat about filters for a second, because for those of you who use filters, and I use filters a lot, I'm a big polarizer neutral density junkie. If you do not have a filter that is as good or better than your lens optically, you are downgrading your entire photographic experience. You want nano-coated filters. They need to be coated on both sides. You want tempered optical glass, either shot B270 or something that thinks they're better than that. Because a filter becomes your new front element. It becomes a part of your lens's optical array. And I have done this, if someone walks in with a beautiful $2,000 Canon L series lens and a terrible rocket fish plate glass filter from some blue and yellow company that has lots of stores, I will remove the filter and say, please do not offend the optical gods like this. They will curse you. And I'll make sure that the associate shows you a proper piece of glass. You think you're protecting your lens, you're only protecting yourself from good images. Please put good filters on your lenses. And they are easily known because they will brag to you about nano coating. They will brag to you about repellent coatings to keep dust and oil and fingerprints off. And they will brag to you about being tempered so that if they do take a shot, they also will help protect the lens to at least a small degree. It's not as big a degree as maybe you would like you to think, but it is to a small degree. And if you are looking at polarizers and neutral density filters, please make sure they're actually neutral. They don't shift green, which a lot of polarizers do, or they don't shift blue or red, which a lot of neutral density filters do when they're trying to sell you on some fancy thing like a variable ND, which tend to be lower quality than standard NDs. You want to make sure you're getting good glass. And I realize it's a B in my particular bonnet, but I want you to spend your money well. A better filter lets more light through, better transmission, better neutrality, better clarity, better sharpness. It gets out of the way of your lens and just does its job. And then from there, let the lens do its thing. But yes, both lenses and filters, look into nano, look into broadband anti-reflective coatings. Make sure they offer you something that works with your lens and not against it. And this is a great example. So here we have two of the exact same polished molded glass aspherical element. One of them is clearly not coated. And so this is what we're talking about, where light enters one edge and then hits the back edge and just bounces around inside the element, because the amount of reflection taking place inside the element is happening because we're not coated for releasing that light. Here on the E-band coating here, with the coating on both sides of the glass, you can't even tell that there's a piece of glass in this foam. And that is the difference between good coating and no coating. And this would be the same thing for those of you who have really cheap filters right now. If you were unfortunate enough to buy a lens online and you got free filters with it, this is the filter pack you got, and offers no value. You might as well drill holes in them and make a mobile for your front porch, as far as I'm concerned. Toss them. Get good filters. So if I have a lens that's properly coated, properly corrected, I can put it and point it directly at the sun and still get at least 90% of the dynamic range of my sensor, even pointed directly at the sun. I'm still getting detail underneath the sunbeams. Everything here looking good. For those of you like sun stars, as you stop down f16, f22, having good coatings helps correct for that. So I don't have as many specular highlights like these two little guys here, getting in the way throughout the entire image. If you want lots of flare, buy old analog lenses. They will definitely do it, and they will have it with character and aplomb, and that's great. But today's digital optics will tend to be a little more clinical in their correction. We are trying to remove this as much as we can, to a certain degree. Now, something to know is that this is actually Tamron's first 15 to 30, their first generation lens in this category, and it was a game changer for the industry, where it built on at the time the best known lens in this category, Nikon's 1424, and it built upon that design, which was a little bit of a partnership. And we went from there and built a new form of correction value. And our flare control from that point forward was considered legendary. Now, I sent this lens in to our director of operations, Pat Simonetti, not the lens, the slide, and I just kind of joked with him that I like to tell our classes that we're not as perfect as we think we are, because look at my specular highlights there, and I've got a little bit of burn in my lens over here, and I didn't know that he sent this to Japan, which is sort of like poking the bear a little bit. And so we invented an entirely new way of coating ultra wide lenses when the 15 to 30 G2 came out. So this is the 15 to 30 G1 and G2 share the exact same optical array. So if we cut them in half, all the lenses look like one another, except we upgraded the optical glass formula, and then we updated the coatings to the new lens. So the new lens is a half stop brighter all the way through, and now it does this ridiculous thing with its flare control. And this is a completely new method of coating ultra wide optics that we invented, and currently is only exclusive to us. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is legendary flare control. That's ridiculousness. I can't believe they did that. If you're a portrait photographer, you don't want your lens to be flaring out all over the place either. You have very specific areas of focus. And when I'm doing specific areas of focus, like for instance, Natalie's eyelashes here, I don't want color fringing. I don't want green and purples hanging out all over the place. And I don't want these whites to completely blow out and take over the entire image. A good portrait lens has good dynamic range. It's designed to spread your histogram across by a good couple steps so that you can control absolute blacks and absolute whites to your taste, not to what the lens manufacturer thinks is correct. So this lens has a very slight amount of vignetting, but there aren't any absolute blacks or whites throughout this entire image, even though the saturation is great. This is a straight JPEG conversion from RAW, specifically for this type of class, just to show that a good lens can do it on its own if the conditions are right. And in this case, it did very well. Ooh, there we go. So any questions on coatings or transmission or anything like that?
Nothing yet. Any questions, folks? Just toss them to me in the chat room there. And if anything does come up, Mark, that is pertains to any of the stuff you've been covering, then I'll stop you and throw it out there. But
awesome.
Otherwise,
cool.
Good.
All right. So image stabilization. Used to be a curiosity, used to be an expensive accessory that you might forego because you want to spend the extra money. Now is becoming a big necessity. The higher the resolution of the camera, the more likely you're going to need stabilization. As you step from 24 to 36 to 42 to 45 to 50 to 60 megapixels, again, the more pixels you have, the more eyeballs you have on any flaw, and that includes movement, yours and theirs. And so our movement, at least, we can offer some mitigation to. Their movement, we just have to use higher shutter speeds and hope that we can freeze them and the autofocus is tracking them well. But as far as our movement goes, we have stabilization options. Mirrorless cameras, by and large, often put this both in the body and in the lens, and DSLRs currently are just optical themselves. And here, since we're discussing optics, we're just going into really what the lenses allow for. And there are two types of image stabilization in lenses. We have the biaxial stabilization unit, which is the old school stabilizer that was invented in the 80s, and often refer to it as the Holy Cross, because it blesses you up and down, it blesses you left and right, and it doesn't know any other angle than 90 degrees. So if you are the type of photographer to shoot the Dutch angle, so you want to go off 90 and shoot 45, this is not the stabilization unit for you, because it will jump around and not understand why you're shooting at 45 degrees, and it can, in fact, ruin your shot. If you are strictly a horizontal vertical shooter, this will probably suffice. They offer a reasonable amount of stabilization. Today's biaxial stabilizers, the best of them, offer 3.5 stops of stabilization. On average, they offer 2 stops. And when we say a stop, we are referencing based on how long you can handhold a lens. It's not so much a given rule, like you should be able to handhold a 200 millimeter lens at 1/200th of a second is the general rule we'll give somebody, the reciprocal of your focal length. But there are a lot of people who cannot handhold a 200 millimeter lens at 1/200th of a second. They will blur the shot. So we are talking about in reference to how long you normally handhold a lens. If you're handholding the lens and we say that the lens has up to 2 stops of stabilization, that means based on how you do it, the lens can compensate for up to 2 extra stops for you. So we're trying very hard to at least take the shake and mitigate you. I generally run my days very espresso oriented, very caffeination oriented. And so my stabilization units are very helpful for me. And I don't mind that. I can focus my brain, but not my hands at the same time. But if I have heavy caffeination, I do find I'm a better photographer. I hate to say it, but that definitely showcases a form of addiction, maybe. I'll go into therapy sooner or later. But so as lenses got better and design improved, we needed to get stabilization that met the deal. And triaxial stabilization was invented by Tamron. So everybody using 3-axis stabilization today, which is everybody and their high-end lenses, owes a nice little gratitude and thanks to us. This is the stabilization unit that can correct in all directions. It's literally floating on 3 electromagnetic coils, and we are using electrical impulses to tell it where to go and where to be. They are stabilization movements, stabilization units are always moving. If you've ever heard a sales associate or a photo educator, or you've read online somewhere in the forum, you need to turn your stabilizer off when you're on the tripod. It is because they're always moving. They move at a very fixed megahertz frequency. And when you interrupt that, it measures your interruption and then counteracts it with its own movement. It literally is designed to zig when you zag. Unfortunately, they don't know why the earth has stopped, why nothing is moving. So when you put it on a tripod, they're there just moving around in that fixed megahertz frequency like a caffeinated kid, just not sitting still. So when you're doing your long exposures, a stabilization unit is very cheerfully ruining your shot the entire time. In general, the rule is if the camera is going to stand still, you don't need to have the stabilizer on. If there's a tripod involved, but you're on like a gimbal type mount, and you are, say, shooting wildlife with a big lens, then yes, you want to keep your stabilizer on. If you're on a monopod, anytime where your hands are still relatively doing most of the control on the camera, and you're not using a cable release of any sort, then yeah, the stabilization units should remain on. But if you're doing long exposures and the tripod is sitting there and its whole job is to keep the camera still, both in-body units and optical units need to be turned off to get the best image. Not that there's going to be a test, but this is what a standard triaxial unit looks like these days. The best lenses will give a brain to the stabilizer and a separate brain to the autofocus unit. So they're not taking power away from each other, and they're also not arguing with each other about who's more important. So a dual MPU process on your lenses is actually important. They make them smarter, they make them more efficient, both battery and speed-wise. So that's a thing for you to actually want to know. But so you'll have your 3 magnets here, the yokes. They are floating on ball bearings in a controlled fashion, and it's pretty wild. If you've ever taken a look at the back end of your lens and kind of gave it a little shake, and you've seen an element in there that just kind of shakes back and forth, that's your stabilization group or element of glass, and it is floating on an electromagnetic coil. So don't shake it too hard, don't shake it too much, but it is designed to move once it gets powered up. So on your lenses, especially the high-end lenses, telephoto lenses, you're going to have multiple modes of stabilization. And most manufacturers have a mode 1 and a mode 2. If you just have a switch on the lens that says stabilization on off, VC on off, IS on off, VR on off, whatever, then you're going to have mode 1. Mode 1 is the universal starting point for all stabilized lenses. And that's a stabilization that you can see through the lens. It activates when you tap your shutter halfway down. And you can actually see the coil grab and float. And it's measuring your movement. And it's kind of nice. It allows you to relax your eyes. You can look through the viewfinder at long distances without having to squint or get headaches. And then especially when you're panning, it can make a big difference. And you know that it's at least taking some of the shake out of your hands. It's rather nice. And depending on whether or not it's biaxial or triaxial, it'll correct from 2 to 4 stops. Mode 2 is especially effective on large telephoto lenses. You'll see it on a lot of 70 to 200s, 100 to 400s, 200 to 500s, 150 to 600s, anything really involving long distance photography where you know you're going to be panning. It is designed specifically for panning left to right, right to left, the camera typically in either vertical or horizontal orientation. Its job is to quit fighting your movement from left to right or right to left and really stabilize top to bottom. So it looks like, even if you're hypercaffeinated, that you're panning smoothly in a parallel fashion. So it's really built around the idea of dragging your shutter. If you want to get the Canadian goose is absolutely invading your neighborhood, but it still looks good in flight. Panning from left to right, you want that feeling of motion. You're dragging the shutter at 1/30th of a second at 600 millimeters. This will help keep that pan looking nice and steady, keep the goose in focus as long as you're maintaining that central point. It's built specifically for panning. It is not good at anything else, and it can ruin regular shots. I have fixed a lot of quote unquote bad lenses by all manufacturers by just telling the photographer to switch from mode 2 back to mode 1. So keeping that in mind. It is built only for panning. If you're not panning, turn it off. Mode 3 was generally considered exclusive to Tamron. It's a function that we invented, but is now being shared out a little bit to some lenses out there. But mode 3 is the most powerful stabilization available to photographers. This is not a mode that does any good for a videographer, but mode 3 only happens at the time of shutter press. Its downfall is that you can't see it. If you're looking through the lens at 600 millimeter handheld and you can't handhold very well, it can be difficult to accommodate this particular mode just because it's hard to relax the eye and it's going to be harder to maintain your autofocus on the subject you want. But if you are, and since super telephoto photography is an acquired taste, it's an acquired expertise. Any birder will tell you that they're an exercise in thousands of shots of futility every week. Mode 3 can do amazing things for static objects. If you have a macro lens that has a mode 3, if you are shooting owls at a distance that aren't going anywhere, or the osprey perched in the tree, or a moose that's just chewing away off in the field, mode 3 will give you the strongest handheld or monopoded stabilization you can possibly get. And in the case of our units, it will either give you an extra half stop or an extra full stop of stabilization over modes 1 and 2. It's very, very good. How good is it? It's stupendous. This is 600 millimeters at 10 feet off the subject at 1/30th of a second. Other attachments. This is straight up. No, I'm not even lying on the ground. Some amazing things for you. If you can breathe right, have good handheld technique, and the subject isn't going anywhere, you can drop your ISO down to 200 when normally you have to shoot 800 for stuff like this and lighting like this. To get a handheld shutter speed that will allow sharpness like this, your stabilization unit can help work for you. For you guys working available light in models, or say babies or pets, something that doesn't like strobes, then this is a good example of the 70 to 200. This is on a crop sensor. So one of the things that crop sensors do magnify is handshake, because the smaller field area magnifies all movements another stop or so. And so in this case, we're looking at the shake equivalent of 320 millimeter here at 1/8 of a second wide open. So yes, stabilization can do amazing things for you. So don't scoff at it. And if you can afford it, pick up a lens that has it. If it's on a mirrorless body, you don't have to worry about it nearly as much because most mirrorless bodies have onboard stabilization, and therefore they're doing their best to take care of you as well. If you can have both, great. That's even better. But those were like torture tests, right? So those were basically to hyper prove the point that stabilization can help you out. What about everyday shutter speeds? This is a really good example of that. Again from Dustin Abbott, who did a review on our 24-70 2.8 G2 and compared it to one of our competitors. And in this case, our competitor doesn't have a version that has stabilization at 2.8. And this is just walking around shooting 70 millimeter, reasonably wide open at 1/50th of a second. And this is a common shutter speed at things like wedding receptions and in ballrooms, in living rooms, anywhere where I have a moderate amount of light, but maybe not quite enough to have a faster shutter speed. Even at 70 mil at 1/50th of a second, the stabilizer was making a massive difference. So it's not just something that you would use for really long shutter speeds or for really long telephoto lenses. It's commonly used in a lot of different lower lit areas, dusk, living rooms, single lamps like I have in the room right now, little things like that. So it is very useful. That being said, something that's not discussed enough is the usable parameter of stabilization. The fact remains that there comes a point both on the slower shutter side, usually beyond the half-second marker, and on the high speed side, usually above 1/2500th to 1/4000th of a second, where a stabilization unit, and I don't care what manufacturer it is, can have the potential to ruin the shot. If you are shooting at super high shutter speeds above 1/4000th of a second, I would tell you to turn your stabilizer off because it can negatively affect the image. And if you are shooting at lower than 1/2 a second, or in some ultra wide lenses case, you can certainly shoot down to a second. But anything beyond that, you're not guaranteed a sharp image either, because the lens is still measuring movement and can in fact have a fluctuation for no reason whatsoever, like might have a power issue or something like that. But beyond 1 second or slower, I would also tell you to turn the stabilizer off. So about a second to 1/3500th, we'll say, just to throw a reasonably average number out there, 1/4000th of a second. That's your usable parameter. Anything beyond those points, it's better to shut your stabilizer off. Even mode 3. So this is where we'll get heavy. And so this is that point where we'll probably take that 2-minute break there, Betty.
Okay. I'm going to just unmic myself. Well, yeah, so we had a question there about stabilization on versus off, but then you ended up covering that at some length. So folks, we're going to take a quick minute here for everybody to get your bathroom break, or get yourself a snack, stand up, stretch your legs, or sit down if you've been standing this whole time.
God, I hope not.
Yeah, God, I can imagine.
Other than
doing great, Mark.
That's normally what we do is when we're in stores, like we're on our feet like 12 hours a day.
That's true.
I'm not used to all this sitting around at home. Still not.
Yeah, no kidding. I've noticed that because usually we, so much travel, so much standing around all day, so much, to and from airports, walking through airports, that it's, I've noticed that is more of a workout than I think we ever consider it to be.
Well, and especially because like my camera backpack, when I'm packing it to the airports, it's 35 to 45 pounds.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
You never know what you're going to shoot on the way from an airport somewhere in a rental car.
That's right. And if it's the new lenses, which, everybody listening into this, we got, stay tuned. We have some very exciting information coming up to be announced very, very soon. But anything, new gear, I've always, it's my rule of thumb to always be carrying it on me, because you never know when, someone's going to want to see that new 70 to 180. There's a question here for you, Mark. Is there a shutter speed that you recommend not using? I think it's with image stabilization.
My general range is between 1 second and 1/4000th of a second. And then after at those edges is where I'll generally tell you to turn it off. It's better to have it off.
Cool.
And that's, to be fair, that's with the best stabilization units in the industry. If you have like a kit lens with a biaxial stabilization unit, the one that only understands up, down, left, right, that can change dramatically. If at that point, I would probably tell you I'm looking more like at like 1/8 of a second, and then probably not further than 1/2000th of a second, unfortunately, because they're not super smooth, they're not very graceful, they don't sync well at high shutter speeds, and so they're better than not having anything. Like anybody who has a kit lens with stabilization unit is happier than one who is not. So I do want to stress that, but there's a reason why they put those units in there, and it's because it's cost effective. And from there, we all pray that you grow and want to grow and buy better lenses and better cameras. Let's be honest. So all too often, both in cameras and in lenses, I will admit this, that it's like buying a car. If you want those floor mats, you got to get a whole other package. And lenses and cameras are no different. If you want a specific feature, sometimes you find out that it's not the next camera up, it's 3 cameras up that you have to buy to get that specific feature. Otherwise, you can't have it. And I apologize on behalf of the industry for that. But I can't change it either. I wish I had that power.
A question, and I don't know how much you can elaborate on this, but somebody wondering to just kind of elaborate a little more on stabilization use during sporting events, night baseball, non-pro. I'm assuming that's kind of like amateur status versus indoor sports. So like basketball, volleyball.
So if I'm a working pro in the indoor sport category, arena football, volleyball, basketball, hockey, if I'm a working pro licensed and have the press credentials, I also have the radio transmitter that controls the strobes in that arena. And so I'm working at very high shutter speed sync. I'm shooting it at 1/2500th, 1/4000th of a second. And that's because when I take a shot, the sun explodes in the room for me at that high speed shutter, and I get all the light I need. If I'm a high school parent and I'm just working with, say, a Rebel, and I rented a 70-200 2.8 for the weekend because I need to shoot my kid's basketball tourney, it's a different story. The flash on your camera, or even a big onboard flash, isn't going to do it. So you do have to shoot it at high ISOs. You're going to be up there at the 1600 ISO to begin, if not 3200 or 6400 ISO, just to get the stopping power to freeze that action. And at that point, when you're freezing that action, quite honestly, unless you're really unstable, stabilization in the lens isn't providing a whole lot of value. When you're shooting a 1/4000th of a second, you can quite literally stop a bullet being shot by a 22 caliber pistol. You have that ability. So a stabilization unit there is really working against you. And at that point, you might as well just turn it off and give the camera one less thing to power or one less thing to worry about. But if you are in a really low lit environment and you have to shoot way down at the rung, 1/100th of a second or something of that nature, then yeah, you definitely need to have your stabilization unit on. If your shutter speed, the reciprocal is lower than your focal length, you definitely need your stabilization unit on. If you're shooting 200 millimeter at 1/100th of a second, definitely have that stabilization on for sure. But if high speed shooting, where I'm freezing action, stabilization is oftentimes just a glamour.
Cool. Let's do one more question here, and then we'll push forth. Well, unless it depends on how quickly you can answer this question, I guess.
Sure.
What would you recommend stabilization for photographing planes, jets, aerial photography?
That is another question of what's your shutter speed at, and with like air shows in particular, where you're really looking to just freeze action like there's no tomorrow. Your shutter speeds are you're gonna want to push them way up there to freeze the action. I'm more concerned with my autofocus precision at air shows than I'm concerned with anything else, because autofocus systems really have problems with that kind of speed at that kind of proximity. Stabilization unit, when you're trying to freeze an F-22 jet at 300 yards off the ground, is not going to do a whole lot for you unless you're panning. If you are having a good run panning left to right, right to left with that movement, it's not a bad idea to have the stabilizer on. But otherwise, again, shooting at 1/4000th of a second or so to freeze that action, or even higher, again, it's really more of a glamour than anything else. And for some lenses, might actually ruin the shot. So I tend to shoot a couple images with stabilization on and with stabilization off. If there's zero, it's a little improvement, I just leave it off. You have a delete button. You'll leave it later. That's why you shoot thousands of images. Give yourself a good couple test runs and see what you prefer, and then go with that.
Cool. I will say let's address one more of these questions, and then that is the last question. We can move on from there. But someone would just like you to flip back to your slide of the owl, the cropped, the owl with the crop factor, and then the one after that. So they would like to
beginning.
They'd like to grab screenshots, screen captures.
Oh, cool. So
probably so that they can crop them, blow them up, and then make prints of them and sell them online.
So this one here, right?
Chris?
Was this the one he was looking for?
Yes, that one.
Excellent.
And then the one after.
The
next one.
This one here?
There you go. Thank you. All right, sir. We
cool.
take us back, and let's move on. Everybody, without further ado, the exciting
the world of autofocus mechanisms as we know them to be today.
Chris says definitely going to take those screen captures, crop them, make them into prints, and sell them. So it's particularly funny because I think those owl photos that we looked at were yours, were they not?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, the photos in this presentation are mine.
Nice.
Okay. So for better or for worse, So if someone says that sucks, well, I might not disagree with you. Yeah, photography is like many things, golf and or mini golf. If you have a good day, you're having a good day. If you're not, you just want to throw it all out. You just want to quit. Sometimes it clicks, and sometimes it definitely does not click. But in any case, you got out and did something. So there's at least that.
Yeah. Alrighty, let's do it. Autofocus.
Okay. So
tell us what we need to know.
Well, I'll do my best. So there's a lot of misconception when it comes to autofocus, and so we're gonna break down a mechanic that has nothing to do with your lens for a moment. We're gonna stop talking about optics for a second here, and talk about the cams that are employed in the modern camera system. There are two styles of autofocus currently employed, and one that happens to be a mix of those two styles. But in any case, your camera is the one making the decisions here. Lenses are receivers of information. They are told when to turn on. They are told when to start focusing. They are told when to stop focusing. If the stabilization unit is flipped to the on position, it is told when to start stabilizing, and it is told when to stop stabilizing. Lenses in and of themselves do not make any decisions on their own. And so when people tell you my lens is hunting, it looks like it, but your camera is hunting. We all know what a hunting camera looks like, and that's when it's focusing from near to far. You hear the zit, 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 zit. We all know that feeling of just total futility because you just missed the best shot of your life. It's the big fish you'll tell everybody about that you should have had, but maybe you deleted it by accident. I don't know. But what it comes down to is when your camera is hunting, It is because it cannot see what it is perhaps you are looking for. It needs to be given more specificity in the autofocus array. Otherwise, it's missing out. Autofocus systems have a minimum amount of light they can work in. They also have a maximum amount of light that they can work in. They will also have F ratio limitations. If you have a lens that's an f5.6 versus a lens that's an f2.8 natively, your autofocus system will work differently with those two lenses because of its own limitations, given what the autofocus cam is capable of doing. So understand that autofocus systems are very expensive. They haven't really changed over much over the last 20 years. They've given you more points and a few things of that nature, but how they do their job really hasn't changed much. And so we're going to talk about the things you'll need. And that actually is in this slide here. What do you want in your autofocus cam? When you're researching a camera and you have specific needs in the autofocus category, if you're a sports photographer, if you have toddlers, which to me is also sports photography, if you shoot pets, also sports photography, or if you're a studio photographer, it's at that point, accuracy is everything and speed is not necessarily everything. Although if you are a portrait photographer who also shoots runway, then speed and efficiency is something you're going to want to consider. And if you are a studio photographer who does in fact work with kids or infants, then yeah, speed of autofocus and precision of autofocus will be a thing for you too, especially with infants because you're not using strobe, you're using available light, and you need an autofocus system that's proficient and available light given the lenses that you're using. You do want more autofocus points. This is, a lot of people make fun of systems that say they have 399 autofocus points or what have you. I would rather have more. I can always take eyeballs off the subject. I can always whittle them down to fewer eyeballs, and I'm good with that. I would like more options if at all possible. If I have more autofocus points covering more surface area of my sensor, then when I'm working with a high-speed object and I'm tracking that object, that means that as it moves from, say, left to right, from autofocus point left to autofocus point center to autofocus point right, I have less space between those autofocus points. And less space between autofocus points means less potential for the autofocus system to drop my subject. Because autofocus systems do drop subjects, often because they moved erratically or diagonally, or because they went to a less sensitive autofocus point, which unfortunately is very common. Most autofocus systems, especially in DSLRs, in fact, specifically in DSLRs, are more sensitive in the center than they are at the edges. And the further away from the center you go, the less sensitive the autofocus system gets. And eventually it just ends up where the point that your subject is on is not as smart as the point it came from. And that point can drop the subject. So I want as many eyeballs on the subject as possible. I also want as many of those eyeballs to be cross-type autofocus points. A little known thing about cameras is that, especially with DSLRs and all phase detect autofocus systems. So if it's a phase detect system on a mirrorless product versus a phase detect on a DSLR, this issue is the exact same. You want more cross-type autofocus points. And the reason for that is a non-cross-type autofocus point is only really good at its job when your camera is in the horizontal position, when it's in the horizontal orientation. If you take that camera and you move it off the horizontal alignment, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, even 90 degrees to a vertical alignment, a non-cross-type autofocus point will lose its efficiency by up to 80%. And that's no joke. Especially in older autofocus cameras. Boy, if you turned an old autofocus system vertical, a lot of cameras would just hunt for days because they could suddenly not see anymore. That is obviously no longer the problem today. We have very good, even horizontal only autofocus points that can still do reasonably effective work when turned vertical. But if it's not a cross-type point, it's not equally sensitive in vertical and horizontal alignment. The more cross-type points you have, the better your camera is going to work no matter the angle you're holding it. That Dutch 45, the 90, the 30, whatever. cross-type autofocus points will be better at autofocusing at all camera angles. And I'll bet that's something that most of you have never even considered could be a problem. But I have issues with long telephoto photographers who have this thing where when they push the camera button, their camera drops by 15 degrees to the right. And it's because their hand-holding technique is unfortunately not very good. But the second it drops to that 15 degrees, the autofocus goes, oh, I didn't realize I was supposed to move. And it does cause a miss. It can cause a miss. So little things like this make a huge difference. More autofocus points, more cross-type points. For phase detect autofocus systems, I don't care if it's mirrorless or DSLR. DSLR systems are vastly phase detect autofocus systems. They are designed almost exclusively around f2.8 lenses. When they tell you that they have 51 autofocus points, and it can utilize all 51 autofocus points at 3 stops darker than normal, they're saying that only with an f2.8 lens. If you have 200 to 500 5.6, or a 150 to 600 that ends up somewhere around f6.3, or a 100 to 400 that ends up at 5.6, that's 2 stops darker than f2.8. You don't get to work at 3 stops darker than normal now. You get to work at 1 stop darker than normal. Your f ratio will dictate the limitation of your autofocus system as well. And when your autofocus system is built around f2.8 protocols and you have a 5.6, you don't get access to all of your autofocus system's capabilities because of that. I wish that were not true, but it is. EV, minimum light requirement, not only does it need bright f ratios, but it needs a certain amount of light to work correctly. And when they give you this, like they'll say, it works down to -3 EV, or the best autofocus systems out there right now can work down to -4 EV. They're giving you that specification with their preferred f ratio. So again, if your f ratio is darker than 2.8, you need to adjust the actual EV requirement, which your autofocus will work. One of my favorites, and here's the rare point at which I pick on a manufacturer because it was pure PR, is the EOS R. When it came out, it said that it worked at a -6 EV. That broke records. Nobody has ever had an autofocus system that could work in that low a light until you got to the asterisk. And the asterisk said, with 1.2 f ratio lenses. Well, yeah, if I've got a sewer pipe for light to fall through, I'll be able to see at -6 EV as well. But when you get to the actual 2.8 sports lenses that everybody's using, it's a relatively average -3 EV. It's nothing special. That's what most cameras are at these days. Our friends at Sony play a little bit of a game too. They'll tell you that it works at -2 EV, and their asterisk is with f2 lenses. So if you have a 2.8 lens, then you'll need -1. You need double the light that you would need versus the f2. So consider these numbers are games you have to play, because unfortunately the manufacturers play them as well. And this is why mirrorless cameras will often offer you a hybrid autofocus where they're mixing phase detect, the DSLR type autofocus system, and contrast detect, where it's using a focusing system that actually uses hunting as a mathematical equation. What you'll see that the lens do very quickly is back focus, front focus, and nail focus. And what it's doing is it's measuring where the edge hardens, where the highest contrast is from one pixel to the next, and that is where it's going to focus. That's what dictates its distance. Contrast autofocus is very accurate. It's highly accurate stuff, but because it relies on contrast and because it has to hunt to work correctly, it is also the slower of the two. So the cameras that offer the hybrid AF will use phase detect to get you close and then contrast to finish it off. And those systems become very accurate as long as they have the amount of light they need to work. So that's where this comes in. We already talked about this slide because I had accidentally overrun the previous one. But your camera is in charge. The camera brings at least 40% of the autofocus equation to the table. It brings the potential of algorithm. It brings to the table the potential of processing speed. It brings to the table its ability to predict movement from one autofocus point to another. And it brings how many autofocus points you have, how many cross types, how bright, how dark, all this other stuff. You know, if If I have, say, let's say a Canon 7D Mark II, and I step into a 5D Mark IV utilizing the same 150 to 600 lens, going from a 70 Mark II to a 5D Mark IV autofocus wise is like having a completely new set of eyeballs. The difference in autofocus efficacy between the two cameras is night and day. And that's the same thing with like a Nikon D500 from a Nikon D7200. With the right lenses, the difference in autofocus speed, efficiency, and accuracy is enormous. And so with people who are getting into wildlife photography, people who are getting into macro photography, anything involving high speed or hyper distance, or small micro minutia as far as distances go, you're going to be asking a lot out of some of these entry-level cameras that really are not suited for it. They quite literally aren't built for it. And this is at the point where you find out you've outgrown that camera necessarily. Or if you are a photographer getting started and you want to jump into macro or high-speed sports or wildlife of some sort, automatically, if you want the best photographic experience, you're stepping into a specific category and above for the camera that you're going to need. I have a lot of folks out here with kids in hockey. With Denver University out here, we have this massive hockey program that's world renowned. And of course, everybody who wants to become a professional hockey player wants to go to DU specifically for the hockey program. And they ask a lot out of the hockey parents. You got to have a lot of video. You got to have a lot of still shots. They want to see form. They want to see action. They want to see how they play in the crease. They want everything. And these parents come up to us and they're like, well, what do I need to do to get this done? And that's when we break their hearts and tell them, I know you're not a professional, but your needs are professional. You're going to need the best, brightest glass in the industry and a camera that can handle it. And we're not going to talk to you about selling it to you because we love you. We're going to talk to you about renting it, and then we're going to try to help you do your best by teaching you how to use it. It's true. Sometimes the gear does matter, and in autofocus in particular, and in dynamic range on the sensor side also in particular, the gear really does make a massive, massive difference in your ability to take the shot. The lens will bring the autofocus potential as far as the autofocus motor, where we'll have sonic wave motors like Nikon's AFS system, Canon's USM, our own USD or Sigma's HSM autofocus motor. They're all acronyms for the same exact type of autofocus motor, what are called ring type autofocus motors. And they use sound waves to start and stop. And a lens that brings one of those to the table brings a little bit of extra speed and a little bit of extra efficiency. But what nobody tells you, and this we include Tamron in this, is what grade of sonic motor are you getting? Are you getting an 18 to 55 with the sonic motor? Or are you getting a 70 to 200 2.8 with the sonic motor? Because I guarantee you, they are not by any stretch of the imagination the same grade of autofocus system. An AFS motor on a 70 to 200 2.8 VR versus an 18 to 55 VR is nowhere near the same grade. And you will see it. And you will see how fast your camera can go. Our version of the 70 to 200 2.8, we have the USD drive on there. If you put it on a Canon Rebel and then put it on a Canon 80D and then put it on a Canon 5D Mark IV, you're going to have three very different autofocus experiences because the cameras are only able to give you so much in the power and the efficacy that the lens needs. If the camera cannot, the lens can't either. And I cannot stress that enough. And here we're going to rely on our friends at Nikon a little bit. I'm not here to slag Nikon. In fact, I would love to give kudos to Nikon right now because they lay out their autofocus systems specifically in their instruction manuals so you understand what you've got going on. And I wish every camera manufacturer did this as cleanly and as well suited as they have done, because it allows us to take a good look and see, well, where are we going to be? Here, I just put side by side the D70-200, which has been a reliable and stable camera in the market for quite some time, and of course the D500, which is widely considered one of the most sophisticated autofocus systems in DSLRs today. The D500 and the D850 share a similar autofocus system. It's not 100% identical, but it's close. It's 51 autofocus points with a bunch of assistant autofocus points, the little black dots here that you don't get to choose, but will help you out. This 51 autofocus point system here is for lenses from 2.8 to 5.6. So if I'm shooting a 70-200 2.8 or a 70-210 f4 or the 200 to 500 5.6, I will have access to all of these autofocus points. I do not necessarily get the same performance out of all of them because they're not all cross type autofocus points. And unfortunately, I do call out autofocus systems a little bit on this across the board for DSLRs. They are definitely more sensitive with the group here in the center than they are out to the sides, even though in the specifications they'll say they all work at the same -3 EV with the 2.8 lens or what have you. I have found this to absolutely not be the case. Their power graph is definitely spiked for the middle, and it does decrease out to the corners. And that's not a Nikon problem. That's actually every DSLR. Canon has the same problem with their 61-point autofocus point system. It's way better in the center than it is out to the sides. But let's just say we decide we're gonna put the widely lauded 150 to 600 millimeter lenses on there. Sigma has 2 of them. We have 2 of them. But unfortunately, to get to 600 millimeter, we can't stay at 5.6. We have to drop that 1/3 of a stop and go to f6.3. Well, the second we get to f6.3, see where it says between 5.6 and f8 here? When we go to f6.3, I do not have 51 autofocus points available to me anymore. If I use a teleconverter, I do not have 51 autofocus points available to me anymore. And in fact, I really am going to be working with the center area here because not only is this the most sensitive part of the autofocus sensor, it's where all the cross-type autofocus points are. So it won't matter what angle my camera's at. I'm able to shoot with better grace. I'm going to focus and track with my object in the center, and I will crop later to finish my story, to finish my rule of thirds, or to finish whatever tale it is I'm trying to tell. But I will be tracking solely with the center points. These horizontal only points out to the sides here, that's nice, but they're useless, really, honestly, because you have to have the camera really specifically in horizontal alignment for them to work well. And the second the camera goes off angle at all, these 8 autofocus points really just disappear, and you're really only using the 9 in the middle. And this is when everything is up to spec. This is when I still have all the available light that I need for the autofocus system to work correctly. If I'm working at dusk with an f6.3 or an f8 lens, I'm probably going to go down to the autofocus point specifically in the center, because that will be our f8 specific autofocus point. It's our most sensitive autofocus point. It's the one that sees the most light and the most information. And as you can see here, let's say I put a 1.4 converter on that 200 to 500, it becomes an f8 lens. I can really only autofocus with the center point. And that's only with really good light, super good light. This autofocus system, like most, is rated for 2.8 lenses. 2.8 lenses at -3 EV. That's 3 stops darker than a reasonably well-lit living room. But if I'm working at f8 here, that's f4 1 stop, f5.6 2 stops, f8 is 3 stops darker than 2.8. Now I have to have at least as much light as a well-lit living room to shoot. And that's our minimum autofocus requirement. If it's foggy, if there's a lot of inversion from a hot and humid day, if there's any form of grayscale happening where the gradation is just really failing, especially at a distance, I'm still going to hunt like mad. I'm still going to be searching even when I'm using the most sensitive autofocus point in this system. So this is a big deal. When you're working with the avenue you wish to go forward on in your photography, if it's wildlife, sports, portrait, whatever, you're going to want to know these specific limitations. And it's funny because they're built around 2.8. It's interesting to note that the autofocus systems built around 2.8 have similar problems with lenses brighter than 2.8, f2, f1.8, f1.4, f1.2. And the larger those f ratios get, the lower the contrast value is on most of those lenses right off the bat. And the shallower the depth of field is, the easier it is to miss focus entirely simply because the camera can't quite grab that edge. And the lens is a little bit lower contrast, or we don't have quite enough light to really darken pixel to pixel. There's a lot of reasons why a camera can miss. And it's true that a lens can also be out of tolerance. A lens might be told to start and it starts, and it might be told to stop and it stops a little bit late. And that's when you get a back focusing problem. Or it starts correctly and it stops a little early. That's a front focus problem. If the lens motor is doing that, that's one thing, but it might also be the camera telling the lens to stop early or too late. And that's where micro autofocus adjustment comes in, where today's cameras, especially DSLRs, will have on board a protocol called micro AF adjustment. They don't do this because you're buying a third-party lens and they know it. They do this because they know that in the end, first party, third party, you're going to need to calibrate and optimize your body and your lens to work to their best ability together. Cameras are built to specific tolerances, lenses are built to specific tolerances, and we're all really trying to do the best job we can for you. But Murphy's Law states you're going to buy a camera at one end of the spectrum and the lens at the other end of the spectrum. Doesn't matter what brand is which, but you're going to put that lens on there, and at 200 millimeter, it constantly front focuses no matter how hard you try to get it to listen. And you're going to either do the autofocus calibration yourself using a program like Focal here to interact with your camera and your lens and a target, and it will measure the values and then optimize your camera and lens communication from there, or you'll send the camera and the lens into the manufacturer and they'll take care of it for you. But in the end, optimization is something that every lens and camera combination will inevitably need. It's not because of flaws in manufacturing, it's because time takes its toll. As a camera gets used through 3 to 4 years, heat, cold, humidity takes its toll. The camera changes size and shape. The autofocus cam changes size and shape. And inevitably, the tolerances are very different. Ditto for your lens. The lens changes a little size and shape throughout as the lens, as you shoot it and it breaks in and it settles. Most people don't think about a camera and a lens needing to be broken in, but they actually kind of have a break-in period. You know, you shoot pretty hard for 6 months, and then right there is when you have a pretty good idea of what the lens and camera are going to do. Your first 3 weeks are absolutely no indication, unfortunately, of how good they're going to work together. It's what happens in your first 6 months. So you really do have to go out and shoot and gather information and see where you're at, and then decide if you need calibration or not. When it comes to companies like ourselves, or Tamron or Sigma, we both have a USB device that you connect your lens to, and we'll connect the lens to the computer and we can update firmware, but we can also go into the lens and calibrate it very specifically. In-lens calibration is far better than in-camera calibration. We can work up to 8 focal lengths at 3 different distances per focal length, and you can absolutely nail your lens for your camera, and you won't believe the difference it sometimes makes. It's often like the new autofocus system. It's often like getting a new pair of eyeballs. Both Sigma and Tamron offer that service also as a part of the warranty. So you can send us the lens and your camera, doesn't matter what manufacturer it is, and we'll calibrate the lens to work with your manufacturer's quirks on the camera, or we'll find out what we did wrong in the lens and we'll fix that, you know, because obviously we're not perfect. We have a flaw every once in a while. But in any case, autofocus calibration becomes a real necessity, especially as, again, you work higher resolution. 24 megapixels just doesn't require the same amount of autofocus precision as a 47 megapixel camera or as a 60 megapixel camera. You really got to start nailing those edges, otherwise you will see it. And as long as the lens has the acuity and the built-in linear resolution to satisfy the sensor, then you should go ahead and calibrate it. Just nail it down to the best of your ability. It's not a hard job, but it is time consumptive. I always recommend Focal Pro specifically. Focal is the name of the software. Focal Pro is a level of software you purchase. We don't make any money on it. I'm recommending it. That's not a Tamron recommendation necessarily, but it's the only one that I've found so far that works well at lenses wider than 24 millimeter. And it's definitely the only one I've found that works well at lenses larger than 200 millimeter. So if you are a super telephoto individual, this is definitely your software. And if you're trying to calibrate and wide angle lenses at infinity, which is nearly impossible to do otherwise, this is also your software, or send it in to your manufacturer and have them do it, one way or the other. But and sometimes because a lens and a camera are enough out of tolerance with one another, that can contribute to the hunting problem, because if the lens isn't stopping at the right point, no matter what the camera tells it to do, then of course it's not sharp, and the camera will continue to hunt because either the lens algorithm is wrong or the camera's algorithm is wrong, or there's a miscommunication that's taking place there. Now, I can only speak for Tamron on this side of things, but we work very, very closely with our counterparts. It doesn't hurt you to know that Tamron is very friendly, and in many cases, we're the OEM backbone of this industry. You all probably own a lens that we have designed or produced for that manufacturer with their name on it, and it's just the way of the world in cameras and automobiles and computers. Everybody has partnerships, and it happens that being the world's largest lens manufacturer, the only one that owns all their own components and integrates everything from the bottom to the top, we can do things at high volumes and low tolerance that other companies simply can't. And it's a good thing. Everybody gets helped out. So it's something that we employ to the best of our ability. And as we work very closely with them, we try very hard to make sure that our autofocus algorithms and theirs are exactly the same. And sometimes, frankly, they just give us the numbers and they are exactly the same. And even then, within those tolerances, you'll still need optimization. And you'll probably need to calibrate once every year or two because of age and Mother Nature and God knows what all. So, any questions on autofocus? Because it's a lot of information.
None so far.
Good deal.
We're doing good.
I hope that was at least a decent amount of info. So we're gonna close out on something a lot easier. Everybody likes to talk about bokeh. It is bokeh, by the way. Bokeh is mouth. Your camera and lens generally are not considered to have mouths, although I suppose I've heard of the lens bay on a camera being called a mouth before. But it is a real word. I have been in forums where people lecture me all day about how bokeh is not a real word. It is, in fact, a real Japanese term. And we use it to discuss the elements that are deliberately out of focus in the foreground and the background, the character, the rendering of those out of focus elements in particular. If we want softer, creamier bokeh, we prefer working closer to our subject. That's old school knowledge. We prefer more compression. So a lens above 50 millimeter will generally allow for that as well. And then we also would like a larger F ratio so we can open it up, shallow things out, and diffuse the foreground and the background. But we also want more blades in our aperture diaphragm because that also helps smooth the transitions between foreground blur to sharpness to background blur. Most professional lenses today have a 9-blade iris. There are a few out there now that have 11. That's also awesome. The more blades, the better. The more blades you have when you stop down for Sunstars, the more points in your Sunstar you're going to get, which is also awesome. And I would like them to be rounded because rounded blades allow smoother transition and color grades and light grades. So it's if you have a lens that produces really nice circular bokeh balls in the middle, but also go almond shape or cat's eye shaped out at the edges, that's very common. That's due to some astigmatism in the lens design. Lenses that are designed for perfect bokeh balls all the way out to the edges are generally not zooms. Zooms really can't afford to do that without being ridiculously huge and stupid expensive. But there are a couple primes out there that are pretty darn close. And they're also very large, very heavy. But for those who want absolute symmetrical perfection, they are out there for the $4,000 to $8,000 price range. This is a great example of how the iris of the lens will change the shape of the specular highlight. Our friend Ben here is formerly of Lens Baby, a company that specializes in changing the shape of specular highlights. And you can drop in a bazillion different aperture diaphragms of different shapes, from stars to hearts to diamonds. You can have the full Lucky Charm array. But in the case of standard lens design, you're going to see a lot of 11, 9, 8 is now coming to the fore for manufacturers, maybe cutting a little bit of a corner. 7-bladed iris. On the left here, you have a 9 rounded bladed iris, and you have on the right a 7 non-rounded blade iris. So 7 hard edge blades versus 9 rounded edges. And this is where, in my opinion, it becomes subjective because, quite frankly, I like both of them. I think they're both very nice to look at. I know that the human eye kind of gravitates towards circles, and we like that innate softness. But I actually don't mind the shape here. What is that? 3, 6, 7, 8. So octagonal, not non-agonal. Can't tell if that's 9 or 8. But in any case, I think this looks just as good. Interesting to note, if you guys see here, you can see the onion skin kind of pattern that's on this particular piece. This is not a low resolution problem. This is actually the polishing pattern on an aspherical element. So you are seeing the circular polishing pattern placed on that piece of glass versus what is likely a much older lens that did not use A-spheres. And in fact, it's probably a prime versus this is probably a zoom, although it's tough to tell. These are both very cropped images. But you'll notice that there's no onion skin pattern here. So the bokeh is actually a little smoother inside the polygon versus the one that's inside the sphere. Which one's better? I couldn't tell you. I like them both, and I think they would both look fine at a wedding shot, in my particular opinion. Those of you who have shot mirror lenses, like the 250 millimeter mirror, 500 millimeter mirrors, you know your bokeh looks like donuts. And I happen to love the donut effect. I use a lot of cycles with the donuts, and for some reason, the custom cycle guys just loved that effect. It was great. So when we're working with a super telephoto lens up here, and this is at 320 millimeters, we know that as we zoom, we compress the foreground and background, and that compression helps obliterate backgrounds nicely. And in this particular instance, it's just lovely. All the colors are there. This is one of the most balanced bird images I've ever shot in my life. And even at 320 millimeter at f11, I'm close enough to the bird that the background diffuses in a gorgeous fashion. It's not busy, it's creamy, and the 9-rounded blade iris really helps us out with that. And that nice definition, that nice separation here between the feathers and the background is both optical correction as well as those blades helping us out. But what happens when you put a portrait grade diaphragm like this into a $400 zoom lens? Well, guess what? You actually get pretty smooth stuff. This is at 300 millimeter instead of 320, but close enough for government work. And you'll notice that background is just lovely. Both of these were shot at f11 at 300 millimeter, and they're both gorgeous. Now, if I put both of these lenses on a 60 megapixel camera, the first lens can do it, the second lens cannot. But let's be fair, those are the upper echelon cameras. Most people own cameras in the 24 to 30 megapixel category. This $400 zoom lens can do amazing things for that person. Even though it's a 10-year-old lens, it's still producing images that's done pretty well. So it's not always about the cost necessarily. It's about what you hide inside the lens. What's the bang for the buck? You macro photographers want lots of blades in your iris because it really helps the transitions inside your from shallow to deep fields. In this case, that was an f5.6 to an f57 transition in the 90 millimeter macro. You'll notice that nothing changed in size or shape. The lens does not have breathing when it changes aperture ratios. That's really nice to know. And those rounded blades really keep the transitions of light here also from having any problems. Great optical correction, no bleeding of highlights. This car is sitting on a light board and it's being lit by 2 large LEDs. It's literally being drowned in light. But good optical correction means no blooming, no bleeding anywhere. And so the blades are helping with that, as are the coatings. This is a lens that's super well designed. In fact, I would have told you until the 35 millimeter 1.4 came out last year, the 90 macro was our representative lens. But now the 35 being the best 35 in the industry, I have to go with that. And then here, this is where everything is kind of coming together. We've got great linear correction. We've got high resolution on a 42 megapixel camera. I've got 2 strobes and 1 really high intensity light up in the corner there, flashing straight into the camera with little to no flare whatsoever. Everything's super well controlled. All of my intensity is fairly equal from corner to corner, although it's true this was a nighttime shot, so there was nothing out here but sky. But if this was a daylit shot, you would not see vignetting in corner to corner here because we're shooting at f16, and the light blade would have flattened out. This is exactly what I want when I tell a lens to do what it's supposed to do on a camera that can handle whatever the lens has got going for it. In the end, the piece that I always like, Ben thinks it's hilarious because I am a nerd and I love this slide so much. But this is everything we talked about. This is the culmination of the process for a lens manufacturer, from fluorine coatings on the front element and gaskets throughout. Your stabilization unit here, the 9-bladed aperture iris here, magnesium and aluminum body, 2 brains, one for stabilization and one for autofocus, and built like a tank, moisture-proof, weatherproof, splash-proof, all the way to the back to the end of the body. This is our 35 millimeter 1.8 actually, exploded in the frame. And one day I'll convince them to give me one of these in lucite because I absolutely have to have it. But that's everything that we came to discuss. That's where we are today as far as lenses go. You guys keep asking for more. Camera manufacturers keep thinking more means more megapixels. That makes my job harder. But we're doing our best to try and keep light, bright, straight, white, and defined. And we're trying to do it without giving you a 5-pound lens. And we're trying to do it without giving you something that's going to cost you $2,000. And so far, at least, our company's done a pretty good job of that. We're not super exotic, but we're very good at what we do. And so far, so good. And then, of course, we have another lens announcement coming up. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
Actually, Mark, I just
forward.
got an email notice. I think it's I mean, I don't know what we are capable of talking about or not at this point. I think we have to wait until tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we do. Unfortunately, you and I don't get to talk about it till 9 in the morning.
Yeah, but it's official. It's out there. So check your internets, everybody. Looks like Mark, it looks like a bit of a time change has passed there on your end.
Oh, really? Yes. It's a little dark here now.
Had a question. Mark's coming to us from Denver. I don't know if we covered that earlier, actually, now that you think about it. A question about any loss of optical quality or sharpness on the 150-600 G2 when using one of the teleconverters, either the 1.4 or the 2X.
So that's actually a question that is answered in a general basis, because the answer is yes, there's always a little when using a teleconverter for any system. Teleconverters are spreaders. They're actually, in a weird way, they turn your current sensor into a crop sensor. They take the image created by the lens and they spread it further across. They create a larger image circle and give the illusion of greater magnification when they do that. It's just like moving your magnifying glass away from your face, and it creates a larger image. So when they do that spread effect, it does lose light, and whatever image quality is there remains, which means that I am spreading that resolution a bit. So if I do have a lens that's, say, 60 megapixel compliant, which the 150-600 very much is, but I spread that and I'm still on a 60 megapixel sensor, I'm no longer getting 60 megapixels worth of information out of that lens. I am lowering the resolution to a certain degree. The best part I can tell you is that at least with like a 1.4 converter, it's not a lot of loss. In fact, most 1.4 converters produce a very nice image. And there's even a couple 1.7s out there that do pretty well given the lens that they're on. But you do have to understand you're losing a stop of light on a 1.4 or 2 stops of light on a 2X, and that does affect autofocus. And it will be detrimental in autofocus performance no matter what. So that's really the biggest loss. I don't have a problem with people using 2Xs or 1.4s on lenses built for such things. Like if you buy like our 18-400, our teleconverters won't work on there, but there are a couple out there in the world that do fit, and I would beg you to please not use them because the image quality is horrific. It's a lens never built for teleconverter, and it should not be using one. Some lenses just shouldn't have attachments unless it's a filter, and most wide-angle zooms are in that category. But you know, like a 100-400 or 200-500 or 150-600, 1.4 is a great cost-effective way to get you beyond those focal lengths. Otherwise, you're staring at $8,000 to $12,000. There's just no between, unfortunately. So, I love the 1.4. I think it's great. I use it all the time.
Cool. Question here: why are the lens elements grouped in the ways that they are?
Oh, so one of my favorite questions that I get is how many elements does this lens have? I've come across some folks in forums who believe less is more or more is more. And the answer is however many were needed to make the lens work. Yeah, that's it. That's really it. So each group has its own corrective factor. And most of our lenses and most other companies' lenses, there comes a point where they're all individually tweaked before they leave the assembly line, especially if they're upper end lenses. Like our high end lens lineup is the SP series, superior performance. That's like Canon's L glass or Sigma's Art glass. We call it SP. All of our SP lenses are tweaked individually before they leave the assembly line. But that specific elemental array, each grouping and definition is already in place by the CAD drawing. So they're there because they need to be. That's the best answer I can give you. Sometimes it's for chromatic correction, sometimes it's for line correction, and usually it's both.
Another question here. What makes a 600 millimeter f4 lens cost $1,000 or more? I think you'll have some fun answering that one.
That sucker is bright. So when you're at 600 millimeter at f4 and you're doubling the amount of light from 605.6, everything has to get bigger. Your front element almost doubles in size. Everything has to follow suit in the back to gather that amount of light and keep it sharp. One of the problems with having really big front elements is the chromatic aberration problem, where the bigger the front element, the more chromatic aberration I'm going to have. It's going to prismatic all over the place. And I spend a lot of time fixing that. And then not only do I have a lot of light coming in, but the more light I have coming in, the lower the contrast is. And I do need to bring some of that back in line. So I do at least have a reasonable black and a reasonable white instead of an entirely gray photo. There is a point where the dynamic range extends to uselessness, and we are trying to give you an image that still has some pop to it. And then doing that at low contrast while also having the high resolution requirements for 60 megapixels, yeah, huge, heavy, really expensive to produce. It's high-end metals, high-end carbon fiber components, something that can take a hit when it drops, even though it's 15 pounds plus. Yep. They're definitely very pricey. You bet. And a thing that a lot of people don't know is that most of those lenses have already been used when they hit the market. When it comes to Olympics, as a good example, both winter and summer, or other big events, those lenses get hoarded by the major manufacturers. They get taken out to those events. They get used by the photojournalists out there, renting or licensing them. They get taken back and refurbished, and yes, they're sold as brand new. It happens all the time.
Nice. Somebody wanted to know if you could recommend polarizers and filters. I know that you are, I don't want to say particular, but you've got your favorites. Yeah.
So I do want to be clear. Good glass, good coatings, neutrality. Those are the three. And there are a lot of really good filters out there. I use ProMaster HGX. I am a big fan of Breakthrough Photography. I have almost exclusively switched over to their stuff, but there's a lot of great stuff out there. B+W still has good stuff. The Hoya high-end stuff is still good. Nice Eye makes some very nice stuff. Polar Pro variable NDs are excellent. There are personal preferences, but unfortunately, it's true. When you get to the good filters, you're buying optical grade glass, like the same stuff that you would buy if you wanted to make one of our lenses, only priced out individually, you lucky dog. So a UV filter can run $100 to $150. A polarizer can run up to $300. And neutral densities, God, the sky's the limit on some of these neutral densities filters. Jesus. If you want a good 10 stop, it's anywhere from $200 to $500, depending on what it's made of. But I mean, just removing my Tamron logo, I happen to use Breakthrough Photography filters a lot, and I love their stuff. It was their neutral density that got me, and their polarizer is probably the best polarizer I've ever shot.
And to add to that point, definitely, if you guys don't know or have any questions about filters that you're looking at, reach out to Looking Glass. Everybody
Absolutely.
On staff there is going to know. They're going to be able to help you. And I would say, go in and talk with people in your local camera dealer, because I, for one, have actually met somebody who had bought one of these gear online, and they got a bunch of free stuff with it. And they had, one of their free filters on the 150-600 G2 was actually causing they thought it was something wrong with the lens, and I looked through it and removed the filter, and it was fine after that. But they, it was causing their, $1,400 lens to be not sharp at all, noticeably not sharp. So
it happens a lot.
So definitely there's you can't say it enough, rely on your local camera stores. That's why they're there. They're going to make sure that, that you are taking care of, that you're getting good, good stuff, good glass in front of your good glass. So you're not, diminishing the quality of your lenses.
Please.
Yeah. Yes. I think was another question here. Somebody had asked earlier about your take on using back button focus versus I guess the front button focus. Is that what we're...
So this is another technique, to each their own. It does not change the efficacy of the autofocus system. There's no change in the mechanics of the lens or of the autofocus cam in the camera whatsoever. It does, on some ergonomics, it does make the camera more comfortable to hold. And it is nice to have one finger controlling autofocus while another controls the shutter button. So you can pre-focus and then time your shot. And I like the thought of that particular technique. I don't use back button focus, but that doesn't negate the fact that it's a quality technique for a lot of people. And it does change how you hold your camera. And it may make the camera, and especially a large lens, more comfortable for you. And if that's the case, then by all means, go for it. I'm not a guy who's going to talk bad about a technique I don't happen to use. I know too many people who get great results because they feel more comfortable with it. I know some people who tell you that it's the be all end all, and cameras operate better with back button focus, and that's simply untrue. It is a comfort factor though. And if you're comfortable, you're more confident, and more confident photographers get better photos. And that's the psychosoma of the situation.
Mel is asking, why doesn't Tamron use AF and M only and not AF/M on the lenses? Mel, can you...
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, restate that one for us. In the meantime, someone's asking the best camera for the 150-600 G2.
Oh, good Lord.
There's
a lot of good cameras.
Yeah.
There are a lot of good cameras. Any camera that has all those autofocus situations that I pointed out, as many eyes on it, as many cross-type autofocus points, that works in as low a light as possible. Those are the cameras you're looking for, and those are the cameras in the upper echelon. You're gonna look at a D500, D850, D780, D6, 5D Mark IV, 1DX type system. For DSLRs, and right now, since it's currently really specifically built for DSLRs, that's where you'll get the best performance out of it. You can adapt it well to Sony systems and to Fuji. In fact, I have a store up in Jackson, Wyoming, that does really well selling it with Fuji X series products, because that little adapter, what was that called? It wasn't the Tech Art. Oh man, there's a great Fuji adapter to
the Fringer.
Yeah, the Fringer. Yeah, the Fringer or the Fringer or whatever. But yeah, it works really well. Apparently, it works great. They sell a ton of our lens with the Fuji system, and they do great work up there. But yeah, it's the autofocus system is what will make the difference in that category. The optics are already there. The lens is ridiculously good. You just want to make sure the camera can back it up. That's really it.
Cool. Yeah. So Mel's question, I think, is about focus override. And with the Tamron lenses, having autofocus selected on the lens, and then the ability to actually then turn your focus ring and focus override. I think the 18400 is the only one that doesn't do it. Yeah, I think the rest of them you have full override capability, right?
Yep, that is correct. Even the 10-24. So right now, with the exception, like Benny said, the 18-400, all of our lenses have full manual override live at all times.
Yeah, and then Nikon, for example, has their AF rings marked AFM. You can switch between AF autofocus and manual and not switch to lens mode. You can do that on the Tamron lenses, actually. I think every one of the lenses for Canon or Nikon have the autofocus and manual switch on the lenses. So.
The Sony lenses do not.
Sony lenses do not, because they're the stable. They're the
yep.
Yeah.
And that
keeping costs down.
That literally was the cost saving measure, exactly. And because the Sony cameras are so freaking customizable, you just make a button, the AFMF button, and you're good. Which is what I do. And that's actually my back button. Is the one that I changed from autofocus to manual focus on my Sony. I shoot Sony and Nikon myself, but on the Sony, I'll switch from autofocus to manual focus just using the back button. It doesn't autofocus for me; it just switches between the two.
Okay. Any other questions, folks? I think we've been doing good. We
do all right,
relatively
guys?
on time, which is really pretty impressive. Is you have this thing down for 2 hours, even with a little bathroom break of a few minutes.
Good.
Nailed it.
Charles,
all right?
says thank you. Did you guys learn a lot? Was it all right? I can't see the chat.
It was awesome. I'm gonna jump in for just a second here and just say, first of all, like there's still 36 people like logged into this right now, and I gotta say, good job, guys. You seriously like hung in there, because there was a lot of really good kind of dense information. It was super nerdy. I loved it. Thank you, Mark. That was great. And Mark, you did so good. I know how hard it is to sit there talking at a screen and be engaging and funny and not get any reciprocation from an audience. So
I talk to myself all the time. I'm all the reciprocation I need.
I practice every day.
Every day. That's my kids. My kids are like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Nothing. What are you doing?" No one here.
I would like to interject and say I cannot picture you, Mark, talking to yourself at all ever.
Thank you for that.
That it's probably he's been building this up all week long. You know, all of his energy. He probably slept in until 5:30 today, just to make sure. Oh, okay. Make sure he had all his energy. And before we have anybody else leave us, I'd mentioned that there was going to be a little bit at the end. For the next 5 days, we actually, by calling Looking Glass Photo, you can call in, order online. I believe calling in is probably the best. Get $25 to $50 in bonus rebates, and those can be stacked on top of national rebates that are already going on. So some of those rebates can be upwards of $100 to $200. So if you're looking at a lens that's $100 off or $200 for the national rebate, and then has a $25 or $50 bonus rebate on top of it, then you're looking at some pretty extensive savings there. So awesome. That's, again, offered through Looking Glass for the next 5 days. Call them for more details.
Thank you, LG, for hosting us, by the way. You guys are awesome.
Thank you guys for sitting and staying with us. It was it's a long one, but like I said, it's one of those that every time I watch Mark give this presentation, it's learning something new, and I feel like he keeps adding stuff in there too. I'm pretty sure that's part of it.
You just wake up at different moments. So I appreciate everyone's time. Sincerely, thanks for having me out too. It's
absolutely
great.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Thank everybody.
The two pretty sections of the country, we should always collaborate. That's all.
Yes.
Agreed. Yeah. And like we keep telling you in some of the other webinars that we've given, stay tuned to Looking Glass for more Tamron webinars. We'll definitely be giving more, and there's of course always more video content and things on the website tamronusa.com and on the Tamron Facebook page. Cool. So if there are no other questions, going once, twice, 2.5.
Done.
All good. All right. See you guys later.
All right. See you guys. Thanks.
Thanks, gang. It's been a pleasure.